being mean to our food. Up to this week, we have been practicing and working with ideas and argumentation that would typically fall under what might be called people ethics. That is, ethical issues and argumentation that are focused on how people treat people, how one human might treat another, or how a group of humans may treat another group of humans. For example, questions like is abortion morally okay? That question is whether it's okay for one human to abort another human. It's not about is it okay for one human to abort, say, a puppy or a kitty. It's human to human questions. An example would be: is it okay to punish one human or a group of humans for their actions? Typically, things that happen within our human society and the human population. That's the sort of ethical issues we've been dealing with throughout the semester, and the sort of values that are associated with those issues, like respect for one another, doing the best for the most people, things like that, all about people. Well, from this point forward in the semester, our focus will shift from human to human interactions over to more human to non-human interactions. And by non-human, that's not meant as a pejorative or a negative word. It's just make a difference between members of the human species versus members of other species, like the species that pigs and cows and chickens and turkeys, all of these other animals and their respective species. So, and also we'll expand after the next few weeks, we'll expand to talk about human to like natural world interactions like mountains and rivers and streams. Our focus expands significantly as far as ethics is concerned. And one of the reasons the majority of the semester has been kind of focused on people ethics is because that's typically where the most ethical work, like humans, it's just our nature to be a little more focused on issues of how we interact with each other and how our sociocultural norms, etc., how they affect our species. But we do live in a world with many other species that may have interests of their own, that may have their own experiences. And we also live in a whole world, a planet with various natural features and resources. So it does make sense to expand the view of ethics as we approach the end of a semester. This week specifically will be focused on like ethical moral questions and arguments surrounding like what's often referred in a negative way as factory farming practices. A little less aggressive way to refer to it would be more industrialized farming practices. And you can make a contrast between that with like little small scale farming things, farming practices where you imagine the little farmhouses on the prairie with all the animals playing in the grass and the people going outside and hand milking the cows every day and petting the pigs. That sort of that idealized sort of way that farming used to be, that used to be the norm of all farming, versus in comparison to contemporary farming practices, say in this country, in the United States. That's what we're focused on, where we have cows herded through gates into gigantic machine operations where they're milked by machines, not by hand, where pigs are placed on inside gigantic buildings with hard concrete floors, and the only way they find food is they're automatically fed every day, and they're sprinkled down with various antibiotics because of all the animals. They're confined in a smaller space. instead of like having 5 pigs and 3 cows, we're talking about 1,000 pigs in in a very small space, or 1,000 chickens in one building. Not little chickens wandering around the yard pecking and stuff like that. No, we're talking about chickens that they don't have a whole lot of room to maneuver in some of these chicken houses. So the more confined, much bigger population, more factory like think of assembly line. Things go into the assembly line and then products come out the other end of the assembly line. So we're comparing this small scale sort of, you know, little farmhouse on the prairie versus, you know, a more factory-like environment where the purpose isn't to get to know the animals, it's to bring them in, raise them to a certain weight, send them to the slaughterhouse, then they're packaged up, they're sent to the grocery store. And what we're looking at this week are the ethical and moral issues surrounding this more industrialized practice. Primarily, the main focus is on the treatment of animals during this industrialized process. The issue isn't so much, one could, as we'll see later in this video, there are some people who would want to argue that raising animals just to kill them and eat them, that practice just in general, which is like animal farming in general, might be morally suspicious or might be morally bad in some kind of way. There are arguments that can be made or reasons offered in support of that sort of claim. But we're not necessarily focused on that. Like, we will not focus on the question of, is it morally okay to raise animals just to later kill them and eat them? That is a big question in animal ethics debates. But we won't focus on that. Instead, we will focus on, for this week, is there something morally suspicious, like potentially morally bad, or maybe not morally the best when it comes to how our animals that we do eat are treated in these more industrialized processes? Like, is it morally okay to treat, say, pigs and cows and chickens and turkeys pretty much any way we want because they don't morally matter? Is that the case? Or might it be that no, even though we are just raising them to later kill them and eat them, they should still have some semblance of decent treatment? Is that the way we want to go? Or is it more like, no, it doesn't matter, we can do whatever we want to do with them? Well, we'll see as we go through this video, but that's sort of the topic of this week. But in order to make sense of this topic, we need to answer a few questions. We need to think first that if there's ever an issue, moral issue, all moral issues, all moral questions, all moral arguments and claims, they all need careful thought. One has to educate themselves on the background in order to understand what's really at stake. It all starts with education. Instead of just, oh, this is wrong or this is right. That's never more true than it is with the issue of raising animals to kill them and later eat them. And the practice is the treatment that occurs during that time period. So we'll just look at a few questions this week, but there are many, many more that a person would need to think about and answer before making a permanent decision about an issue like this. But the first question we'll look at is, well, how many non-humans, like members of other species, like pigs, cows, chickens, how many are actually raised and killed for U.S. consumption by meat eaters each year? How many? How many animals are we talking about? It's lives, and remember, if we're thinking in terms of a consequentialist picture, the numbers matter. So we do need to have some sense of how many animals are we actually talking about, non-human animals. The next question will be, what are current factory-style practices? And why are these practices, why do they exist today? They have not always existed this way. Why is today the way it is as far as the way our food is raised and produced and ends up in the grocery store? Why is it the way it is today? The next question is, are these factory style or industrialized, to be a little more generous, are these industrialized practices especially mean to our food? Meaning, are the animals treated badly? And like, is it true that a sort of corporate farm by, say, Smithfield Foods, are the animals treated really badly every day or any day or not at all? We'll see about that question, see if we can find some answers to it. And then there's the actual moral or ethical question. Is it morally okay to be mean to our food animals? Like, or is it not a problem at all? Can we treat if an animal is not a member of the human species, is it okay for us to treat that creature any kind of way we want? Or are there some moral restrictions? Do we have some obligations, some responsibilities or duties in regards to how we treat other creatures that are not of our own species? And then the final question is, like, say that after we've answered all these questions and like the average person would like to do something in regards to factory farming practices. Well, what can the average person actually do? Like, and there's a reason for asking that kind of question. It's one that we haven't asked in, much in previous weeks, but it is a very good question for this kind of topic. And we'll see what some answers to that question might be. To get started, we'll start with the first question. How many non-humans are raised and killed for U.S. consumption each year? Well, the approximate numbers, and there's links to the sources where I look these up. Typically, it's the USDA. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, they have a statistics firm that collects, numbers from the various meat processing plants across the nation. And there's also the agricultural census data. That's how these numbers, that's where they come from. Are they going to be 100% accurate? No, because not everybody's going to report. The counts can be missed, but these are ballpark numbers that are reasonable numbers to think about. So in terms of, and the notion of slaughter, sometimes that has a negative connotation, but in this case, it's just what they're referred to. They're referred to as slaughterhouses. The animals enter the building, they're killed, and then they're processed into meat products or packaged up, shipped to grocery stores. So you could say livestock processing numbers if that seems a little less, contentious. But at the end of the day, in terms of 2017, the number of cows, like beef cattle, that's estimated to have been raised and killed and processed was around 2.58 million animals. Veal cattle, which is a smaller, that sometimes it's called baby cows, but we're talking about typically 50 to 80 pound cow. I mean, it's not a baby, it's not a newborn, but it's not very old either. So veal cattle, 46,000. Pigs, 10.5 million. 10.5 million pigs every year are raised, killed, and then processed and sent out for human consumption. These are lives that ended. That's the way to think about these numbers. These were living animals that were raised up and then they were killed so we could eat them. And then sheep, 188,000. Chicken, broiler chickens, which is your typical chicken you'd find in the grocery store, about 9 billion. Think about that, 9 billion chickens. That's a lot of chickens. Now, that number, it may be a little less than that. I had some trouble homing in on a perfect number for that, but that tends to be the consensus, about 9 billion chickens. And then turkeys is 244 million. Now, just for comparison purposes, the whole human population of South Carolina was around 5 million people in 2017. Think about that double the number of pigs were raised, killed, and eaten. So if all the people in South Carolina, if we doubled that number and then we raised them, killed them, and ate them, then we would be at the number of pig lives lost in 1 year. I mean, these are 1 year numbers. And half the amount of like the human population in South Carolina, that 2.5 million, well, that's half of 5 million. That's how many cows were raised and killed for human consumption. So we're talking about a tremendous amount of lives lost so that we can eat them. And granted, there's many more humans in terms of the entire United States, and that's what these numbers are based off of, the U.S. total numbers, that there's a lot of humans here. But then you look at that chicken number, that 9 billion chickens, there's only about 7 billion humans in the planet, supposedly, a whole globe. And just the U.S. alone killed 2 billion more chickens than the entire population of the whole planet with humans. That's tremendous. That's why that number kind of irks me a little bit, but that's the number I keep coming up with every time I've looked at this. And that just lets you know that is a lot of non-human lives. I mean, that's a lot of lives, no matter how a person does, regardless of the morality. The morality, let's put that on the side. Just the reality of that amount of lives that are lost so that humans can eat meat. It raises some flags where you're like, whoa, this is a lot of numbers of life that we're talking about. And so the questions one could ask, just practical, everyday questions, not especially moral questions, just questions of reality. Like, are these numbers necessary? Like, is it necessary to raise and kill and then have ready for human consumption 9 billion chickens in the United States each year? Is it necessary to raise and then kill for human consumption 10 million pigs? Is that necessary? Do humans, and necessary, well, necessary for what? Well, do humans need that much meat in the United States in order to survive? Well, the answer to that question is very likely no. We don't need as much meat as we eat. We may need meat. We're not getting in a discussion of can humans survive as vegetarians. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. There's some scientific data that would say we need protein, especially during pregnancy and things like that. And protein's necessary. And our other sources of vegetable-based protein, is that an equal substitute to like the meat from chickens and cows and pigs and turkeys? That's where science is still working. But the idea is most numbers will say that we don't need nearly as much meat as we actually eat in the United States. That we don't have to do 10 million pigs. We don't have to do 2.5 million cows. We could do less and everybody would still survive. So now how much less? That's where science comes in. That's where we need to look at the data. But in terms of just the reality is, does the human species that exist in the United States have to have as much meat as it does have? No. It does not have to have as much, but how much less? That's where we need to look at numbers. But it does seem to be the case that we do not need to end this many lives and raise this many animals for meat. But the numbers are going to matter. And that's when we would get into how much protein do we actually need, and how much needs to come from meat animals versus vegetable matter, plant matter. That's when we do those numbers. But just the baseline answer to this, are these numbers necessary for human survival? No. But are these numbers necessary to meet demand? Like how much meat people want to eat in the United States? Well, yeah, that's what these numbers are based off of. Is that this is the supply that meets the demand by humans. Like, this is how much humans will buy and consume if it's made available to them. This is how much that humans will eat if made available to them. Now, sure, some of these things, it goes bad on the grocery store shelves or in transport. That it's not necessarily the case that just because 10 million pigs were eaten that we ate all the meat that was produced from that. There's other numbers about how much, went bad in transport, how much had some problems that it had to be condemned and not put on the grocery store shelves. There's numbers related to all that. One can go to the USDA, their website, and you can find numbers about that. And how much was inspected, etc. That is public information. It's available. It can be found just doing a search on the USDA website and other websites like the Chicken Council and plenty of other places. But the take-home message, though, is this is a whole lot of animal lives, a whole lot of non-human animal lives, that it's necessary to meet human consumer demand in the U.S., but it does not seem to be necessary for all the humans in the U.S. to survive. Less animal lives could be sacrificed, and humans in the U.S. could probably continue to live just as well as they have been living, just with less meat. So that's sort of the numbers. Now, take that as you may. Does this inform us about what we should or shouldn't be doing? Well, as far as morality goes, anytime any living being is harmed or hurt in any kind of way, there's always going to be some moral or ethical concerns raised about it, especially when we're talking about these large of numbers. I mean, this is a lot of pigs. This is a lot of cows. This is not little bitty dinky numbers when you compare the human population just in the state of South Carolina and then the whole world population, and then look at the number of chickens. That's a lot of life. So there is room for morality to step, or ethicists to step in and say, okay, is there something kind of odd about this? Well, let's continue to the next question. Well, what are the current factory practices, and why are these practices in existence? Well, one of the main reasons, just to jump to the why, is why was this amount of animals, why were they raised, killed, and sent out for consumption? Well, to meet demand. I mean, this is U.S. demand-based numbers. This is how many animals were needed in some way to meet consumer demand and have the grocery store shelves full with meat products. That is one of the whys behind it. Why so many animals? Well, because there's so many people that want to buy so many animals. So that's one of the whys behind it. And that implies that if less people were buying, there would be a less demand, and then there would be less animals needed to be raised, to be killed, to then shipped and packaged out for human consumption. That if demand went down, then supply would go down likewise. Typically, that's what happens, but then we live in a more global society where we may continue to raise and kill just as many animals. They just may be exported to other countries. So that's where some of these high chicken numbers come from, is some of these chickens, like at least about 2 billion of them, are exported to places like China and other Asiatic nations. And so not all of these are necessarily, not every animal that's raised here is necessarily consumed here. You got to keep that in mind as well. But these are the numbers that were raised, killed, and processed for consumption. Some of them would have been exported, and then the rest end up on our grocery store shelves. But that's some of the why of it. Is why so many animals? Well, demand. People want the animals, so somebody's going to do a business that provides them. We live in that sort of supply-demand framework as humans. And if there are people that want something, there's a demand Typically, somebody, or many somebodies are going to step up to supply that demand. It's just the way human society, our species, tends to work. But before we keep talking about the why of it, there's way more whys that we need to think about too. But what are these factory style practices versus like smaller scale practices, non-industrialized farming? What does that look like? Well, I can talk from experience in this topic because my family and my dad, that I grew up until about the age of 16, my dad was a very small scale pig farmer. Had about 30 sows, one male hog. He produced, in terms of how many pigs were raised to go to a slaughterhouse every month. Every month to 2 months, 20 or so pigs, and they were what were referred to as fattening hogs. So we're talking about pigs that are about 200 pounds, maybe 250 pounds, and they're not nowhere near adult size. A full-grown pig can be 400, 500 pounds. So they're not at adult size. They're more like teenagers, and sort of teenage pig size. And that was my life as a kid. My father was a farmer. He grew peanuts and soybeans and corn. And he grew corn, which he used to feed the pigs. And then there would have been supplement, various other things you have to buy to keep the pigs growing, getting bigger faster, so you can produce in a consistent manner. And so I loved this as a kid. Now, in terms of being around the pigs, the animals themselves, I was fascinated by it as a kid, and all the way up into my teens. Yes, it was kind of the smells pretty awful near your house, and it's extremely dirty. It's muddy. Pigs like to root in the mud. They make a mess, but that's how they cool themselves, because they cannot cool down like humans do. It's not that pigs are necessarily a dirty creature. It's just that the only way they have to cool themselves is typically through their breathing, through out of their mouth and their nose. They don't have like sweat glands like humans do, so they can overheat very much quicker than a human being can, and so they tend to like to be in cooler, wetter, damper environments. They're able to be cooler because of that. But it was great as a kid, and as a kid, I envisioned myself following along in Dad's footsteps to do pig farming. Now, it was extremely interesting to me. And I had that kind of plan. Even when I entered high school, like the first year of high school, I still had that in my mind as a kind of goal, that and mechanics. But what happened is that, and we'll get into the why of it, but the idea is, so what were the conditions and the treatment of the pigs on the small scale like my dad did? Well, not bad at all, really. The pigs lived in a sort of open environment. They had buildings they could go into when it got cold. We'd put hay in there so they were warm in the winter, and they were cool in the summer because they had various mud holes they could go in. They lived pretty much a pig life. They rooted in the dirt. They were able to hunt for bugs and whatever in the dirt like they like to do. They were fed every day on a regular basis. They were able to interact. They were able to make more baby pigs. They pretty much, the only restriction were they were confined to quite a way large area. Given the size of the herd that we had, it was a huge area for the amount of pigs that were actually there. And so they lived, the only restriction was they had to stay in a certain gated and fenced area with various fencing, electric fencing. Pigs are notorious. They will dig and escape from most kinds of fencing if given the chance. Why? Well, because they're smart creatures. They can think and problem solve, and they will help one another escape. I've seen this many times. I'm not saying that they have minds like humans or anything, but pigs are in many ways smarter than dogs. that you can put a dog in a pen. It may dig out, it may not. I've never seen pigs that will not try to root their way to freedom. That pigs, they are inherently curious. They want to escape if given the chance. Well, it's small scale farming. I mean, we would talk to the pigs, you pet the pigs, and then at a certain point in time, when they reach a certain weight, you load them on a trailer and carry them off to the slaughterhouse, and they're turned into meat that's distributed to the grocery stores. That was a small scale pig farming, my experience as a child. And we had some cows, they were in the open pasture lands. It would be everything that they talk about today as free range and organic and all of that stuff. All of those labels would have applied to my dad's farm. And it was pretty okay. You know, it was, now there is something to be said for the fact that pigs, they did not grow to be adults if they were not the sows that were being bred and having babies, or the male pig that, that was there. If they were not of that herd, the children would be sold off at a certain point in time for human consumption. And some organizations would consider that to just in itself be a morally bad thing. But in terms of treatment, like were they treated bad, like beat on or put in bad environments or confinement on a day-to-day basis? No, they were not. And that tends to be the case with many small-scale operations. Not always. That's one of the keys to keep in mind with this whole topic, is that small scale, just because there's like under say 300 total pigs, it doesn't mean that they're not put in confined spaces. Some small scale farmers do that because it eases the process. They're easier to clean up behind, they're easier to load, and they're easier to feed. When you have them in these big open spaces, they don't always show up at the same place at the same time. That means that pigs are, like we think, the sort of pejorative way, that if you throw feed to pigs, the ones who are there will eat it all up. And those who are not at the trough at the right time, they won't get fed that day. And so you can't be as consistent with this more open, free range sort of pig farming as you can if you confine all the pigs to a building with a concrete floor with a trough that's wide enough for all the pigs to go to, and all of them are really close together. You know that every pig's going to be eating about consistently the same amount every day, and that allows you to do better scheduling and organizing of your time. And it's a much easier to load them when they're in this free range environment. You have to spend a lot of time herding them up to the trailer, and the trailer is a totally foreign sort of experience for them. They're not going to be really quick to want to get on the trailer with a wood floor when they've spent their whole life in dirt and grass. That the industrialized process does take place at smaller scale farms today. It did even when my dad was doing it. He just chose not to go that way because his family had never gone that way. It's a choice that a small scale farmer can make. They can be more industry-like with concrete floors and confined spaces, or they can be more open-ended like my family was. But I wanted to be the small scale pig farmer, but I also have cousins to this day that are large scale farmers as far as cows and pigs and chickens and just poultry in general, turkeys and ducks. And some members of my family, they do it on a large scale where we're talking about 1,000 head of cows. There are 2,000 head of cows, and they're in a more confined space, and they will tend to be like confined a lot more. They see the sunshine a whole lot less. That tends to be the hallmark of a more industrialized practice. Because keep in mind, what is the purpose of a factory setting or an industrial setting is to ease the manufacturing process. Instead of having all your parts strewn all over a giant building, you have every part in its place and you know where it is. You can put your hand on it, and it's got an assembly line conveyor style system where the parts go in, the product goes out. That's more industrialized setting. And then that will typically involve concrete flooring, which, for those who don't know, pigs and cows and horses and goats, a lot, especially pigs and goats that have this sort of cloven hoofed foot structure, they tend to develop quite a bit of problems. It's painful for them to stand on concrete floors day in and day out. Their toe system is set up for more soft ground. They're made, in a sense, nature is they're built such that nature didn't make concrete, it made dirt and grass, and that's where the pigs for generations have lived. And when you put them on concrete in the industrialized setting, their feet they tend to have a lot of feet problems. They tend to have a lot more foot infection problems. They tend to be a little more miserable than they would otherwise be. And that can be made more or less so. But that can happen on a large scale or a small scale. And that just the confinement itself, remember with things like pigs, I keep talking about pigs because that's what I have the most experience with. But the same can be applied to chickens and other things. But it's especially apparent with pigs that can only cool through breathing out of their mouth. That's the primary way. Some heat escapes, through just convection out in the environment through their feet. But they're breathing. And then when you put a whole lot of these animals in closed spaces, just like when we have humans and we go in a smaller room for an assembly or something, then it gets hot quicker. The heat rises from all the human body heat. Well, that happens with pigs in confined spaces too. It happens with chickens. It happens with cows. They're no different than we are in that regard. They notice the difference. And that can become a problem with pigs because they overheat a lot quicker than we do. So putting them in a confined space immediately kind of raises concerns about overheating. That's why a lot of these places will have sprinklers in the ceiling. That's a hallmark of industrial practices. They'll have overhead sprinklers, which they use to not only sprinkle the pigs with water, but they'll also disseminate various antibiotics for the foot infections and various things because of the confinement. But so that's one way to keep a kind of sense of how this works. The more you put your animals on dirt and mud, the more it's in these open fields, that is less factory and industrial like. The more you put them in concrete buildings with concrete floors, where there's a lot of automation associated with the feeding, the medication dissemination and distribution, the more it's in that direction, the more it's industrialized and factory like. That's really the big difference between the two. I've always made the distinction between mud versus concrete floors. That's an easy way to get an initial conception of what the difference is. Imagine a cow in an open field versus a cow in a building with a concrete floor with maybe some hay strewn in the floor, but it's still got a hard floor. So soft floors versus hard floors is a decent way to get a sense on what is the difference between these two. And that difference can matter in terms of animal well-being and comfort. Remember that certain animals have a foot structure that doesn't seem like it was ever made for this kind of environment. But we can... So, crowding, the difference between 30 pigs on 5 acres or 10 acres versus, even way more than 5 acres. Like ours was like 25 acres for 30 sows. That's almost an acre per pig. That's a lot of room for a pig. But then imagine where you have like 1,000 pigs in 10 acres. You see the amount of room is diminished tremendously. The amount of animals is increased tremendously. And so typically factory sort of farming, the animals will be much more crowded. They'll be much more confined. Their food typically has to be altered when you have animals out in this more open range environment where they're on the actual dirt and the grass. They tend to have a more varied diet, but because you can't control it as much because they're out, they eat whatever they find that they want to eat. Just like dogs that are, you let out your dog, your cat in the yard, and they catch and eat whatever they can. And then you may feed them the food, but they have a more variety of the diet typically. Well, in industrialized settings, the food tends to be very, very well the same. It's like homogeneous. Every pig or every cow gets exactly the same portions, pretty much exactly the same type of food day in, day out. So there's not nearly as much variety in their diets. And typically, this is true though anymore, that most all animals in this country at least have some form of genetic modification. Where pigs, contemporary pigs, if you tried to go and buy one today, unless you're buying like say the sort of rare breeds like the Tamworth, most any other, the Yorkshire Durocks, Yorkshires, Durocks, Hampshires, all these various pig breeds, most all of them are going to have been modified to put on weight quicker. Just like any chicken, you're typically going to buy is going to have had its genome modified so that it grows bigger, the thighs, the breast, the parts of the chicken that we eat. Most of them are going to be modified, even if they're at a local farmer's market. Most all of them are going to be GM of some sort because that has saturated the market and the animals have interbred. And so it's not like, that's some of that sort of misnomering in the public where you think of, oh, this is a non-GM cow. Well, not really. I mean, just having lived in it, you can't buy such things hardly anymore. That it may be a far generation down from that. It may have been 5 generations back when a predecessor was genetically modified to put on more weight or have a different muscle structure. And keep in mind that when we're talking about meat animals, the genetics that are modified are those that enhance the parts of the animals that we actually eat. That it's intended that if people prefer to eat like pigs that have more leanness rather than fat content, well, you can modify the genetics of the pig to achieve that. And as far as the production side of it, you can modify the genome of an animal so that it gets bigger faster. And then that means it takes less feed to achieve a greater weight, which means the farmer can sell the pig, can bring it up to sale weight, and sell it much more rapidly, like months difference. And that means more pigs or more cows or more chickens or turkeys can be produced in a much quicker rate, which cuts down on feed costs across the board for the producer. And so that genetic modification is in many, if not pretty much all the standard things that we buy in the grocery store. A GM label, not genetically modified, that you may be able to find it in plants, but in terms of meat animals, I would always look at that as extremely suspicious, just in my experience. There may be counters to that, but in my experience, the GM and genetic modification is pretty much widespread in contemporary meat animals in this country. May not in all countries, but in this one definitely. And that's a hallmark of industrial agriculture. So even if it is a free-range animal that lives just like my family did, it still had GM qualities to it. It's just we were not as heavily involved in genetic modification during Dad's days of pig farming as we are today. But it was there even then. And then there's also growth enhancers that are put in the feed to make the animal put on weight quicker, to develop more muscle quicker, the various vitamins and minerals. It's called a supplement. Like vitamin supplements, you feed supplements to your meat animals too. Typically in this country. Not all people do that, but the majority do. And because the majority is industrialized anymore. And then antibiotics, that tends to be a side effect of industrial practices. Like when my dad's farm, it would be a rare case where pigs needed for a vet to come by. That it was a rare moment, and because the pigs were typically healthy, they didn't have any problems, any diseases. They were living as pigs typically do. They were in a confined environment, that's true, but they had a lot of room inside their confinement. That doesn't take away the fact that they're confined, but they're still not confined like the industrial style where they're shoulder to shoulder since the moment of birth. And that's just like humans. If we put a whole bunch of humans in a smaller confined space, then every one of them breathing around, if one person has a cold, well then it's way more likely that many people around are going to catch that cold. Whereas if you have animals in much more open spaces, one pig that might catch a cold, it doesn't necessarily translate to the whole herd because there's so much more space. And that pig can kind of self-isolate away from the other pigs, or the others will isolate from that one. I've seen that happen too, that they can sense that there's a sickness in place. They move away from the sick one, and then that one gets better in their own time. And so there's less need for various antibiotics in these more open range, open field raising conditions. Whereas confinement, just like it would with humans in close quarters, disease and illness is more common. And it's written off as a cost of doing business, that the cost will be weighed against how much it would be to antibiotic the pigs or the cows or the chickens, the turkeys, versus how many are going to be lost. Like it's a typical 4% to 7% loss of animal life due to illness is just part of doing business anymore in the industrial setting. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it would have been devastating when we had a small herd to lose even one or two pigs. That's a tremendous loss on the small scale, but on the large scale, it could be hundreds of thousands of cows or pigs that are lost. But if you're dealing with 100,000 cows, does it really matter? That's kind of just the cost of doing business. And that's not to be crude or crass, that's just explaining this sort of thought process. Like any production system, there's going to be cost associated with things that come out not to specification. There will be defects. And the more industrialized you go, the more rapid you try to do something, the more problems will arise. So you try to streamline things and then write in how much you expect to lose from the very beginning, and then you don't worry if you lose a certain number of animals. That's a hallmark of industry. But interestingly enough, that it's not necessarily the size of the farm. I have seen people that had 10 acres of land that still used industrialized practices by confining their animals to a really small space on their land. They don't fence in wide areas and let them walk around much or see the sunshine much. And they use all the same industrial things with the antibiotics due to the overcrowding, to the confinement, to the foot infections. They do the same thing, even though it's a little bitty operation. It may only have 100 pigs. I mean, in terms of little, like hobby farming with animals is typically like 50 to 100. The larger scale gets anything above that. And I've seen some of my cousins have it. They'll have a building with 100 chickens in a very small place. And that's just the way of it. Whereas in another place that could be much smaller than my cousin's land, they do the same thing. So it's not the size of the farm. That's not what dictates whether it's factory or factory industrial style practices versus more open range style practices. It's not the size of the farm. It tends to be what the farmer chooses to do. It's a choice that's made by the farmer and the company they work for, because the company they work for will provide and subsidize certain building construction and various things. So sometimes a farmer may prefer to do it more open range, but the corporation that they have a contract with would prefer it to be done in the more industrialized fashion, and so the person wants to farm, so they go along with it. So it comes down to outlook and temperament. Might be much more important than the size of the farm. It's a choice that's made, whether it's factory or not. But it's not, there's reasons for that, and we'll see. And the money, that it costs a little bit more to do it more open-ended than the industrial thing. That's the whole purpose of a factory style setting for animals or any product, is to cut down on cost. It takes less money to produce more, typically. Not always, but typically. So there is a money issue, and it comes down to what the farmer chooses to do. And that's based on real concerns, like wanting to make enough money to feed their family. It's not made out of, typically, the places I've been to some places where, where the people were very mean temperament toward the animals. They didn't care. They were just an item that they're pushing through to sell so that more can be made to push more through. I've been to places like that. But I've also been to places that are factory style where the animals, the people working there, do care about the animals, and they're not mean, they're not being indecently bad to them. It just depends on the operation. So why though? Why did we go away from these more open range, like my dad's style farm, to these more industrialized farms? Well, there's a lot of reasons. But much of it has to do with the changing in the markets. That my dad got out of the pig business because the price of pork just dropped. In our area, it went to nothing, where you would spend way more in feeding the pig to get it up to the weight to sell it than you would ever get back out of the pig. Well, that's immediately bad business. You can't produce something and not at least get your cost back. And you typically need 33 1/3% above your cost in terms of profit just for a business to survive. It won't thrive at that necessarily. It could, but typically that 33 1/3, that's I remember that from when I was in I took a lot of accounting and business classes at one time, and that 33 1/3% above your cost will typically keep most businesses in business. And that was not possible at the time my dad and most of the farmers in this area quit with pigs. That the price had dropped so low per pound that there was no way, given the amount that it costs to feed the animal, to ever even get your cost back, much less 33% profit. I mean, 10,000% profit's even better than 33, but 33 is kind of the minimum to stay in business, and it was no way even possible to do that anymore. So that is one of the reasons why people went to more industrialized practices, because even if the price is low, if you can put out 100 times more animals, you can still make a profit based on volume. Like, this is a sort of Walmart calculus where Walmart tries to spend as little as it can for the products so it can turn around and resell them to the customer and make as much profit as it can. But Walmart can't, it tries to keep their prices low, and just like the grocery stores do, and that means that they're based on doing volume sales. They want to sell a whole lot of products that they may not make as much as they could off of each individual product, but that gets worked around because they're selling so many more of the product. So think about it. If you're only going to sell, like, say, 5 of an item, and you want to sell those 5 items those 5 items cost you $1 a piece. You want to sell them for $3 a piece. Okay, well, that means that you get $2 profit. 5 times 2 is $10 profit. after you spent the, whatever it was, they're $1 a piece. So you spend $5, you cover your $5 cost and you make $10 on top of that. Well, that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is you spend $1 a piece and you only sell them for $2. So you're only going to make $5 profit. But the idea is, say instead of selling 5, you sell 5,000. You'll make more money. And that's just basic. Just basic. People in here would be familiar with that. Well, that's some of the motivation. Why did people try to produce more animals? Well, to try to make the money up that they couldn't make on selling small scale, they try to produce way more animals to make profit from volume sales. And that's one of the reasons for industrialized farming. Moreover, it cuts down on overhead costs because if they're in a closer space, you can more systematize the way they're raised, control their feed. You can control things a lot more closely and, calculate your cost a lot more closely when they're in a more confined setting. And you can account for how much water bill is going to be, how much your food bill is going to be. You can do all of that stuff more streamlined in an industrial setting. That's some of the reasons for it. But why was the price dropping, though, in these smaller areas like my family lived? Well, there were various trade policies. There's like NAFTA, free trade agreement. We hear about these trade agreements. Many people, everyday people, don't put much thought in them at all, but they do make a huge difference on individual farming people. Because if the United States allows trade to enter our country and it can be sold for a much cheaper price than it could be for that product made by people here can sell it for, and then consumers tend to buy the cheaper price product, then that can have a huge impact on, we don't need as much. The demand for homegrown cows drops when we can buy cheaper cows from Mexico. And it's just that simple. So trade agreements can make a huge difference, and they did at the time. Those trade agreements were enabled a lot of other countries from outside of the United States to import their animals into this country. Well, there's only a certain amount of consumers in the United States, and so any cow or pig that comes in from another place and someone buys it, well, that is a customer, a consumer that didn't buy a pig or cow from here. Well, that means that the markets that the farmers are selling to, they have to account for that. And so they lower the price per pound in order to not take a big loss. They don't want to, like the pig market or a slaughterhouse or meat production company is not going to just buy all the pigs that are available to be sold in the area. They're only going to buy as many as they think they can sell. So that creates a bottleneck for the smaller scale farmers, where the companies reduce the price and the governments do, the states do, and that kind of makes farmers slow down on how many they're actually producing, because they don't, like any business, you don't want a whole bunch of surplus inventory that you cannot sell. And so the market price is lower. Well, farmers here can't sell as much, so they quit producing as much. Or they try to get better government contracts and government subsidies. And a subsidy just means that there is a price you're going to be paid for the item, but then the government will give you a little bit more on top of that. Typically, that's the way it works. So it could go that you're not going to have to pay as much tax because, if you are in this kind of business, like some agricultural business growing soybeans versus peanuts, you may get more of a tax write-off if you did soybeans rather than peanuts. And that's how these subsidies things tend to work. It's much more complicated, but these are just a basic, like bottom level reality of such things. And so these declining market prices, these lack of subsidies in certain places, the various trade policies that instigate this kind of stuff, that all of that feeds into the livestock market. And then at a certain point, it becomes a bad business proposition for small scale, and it can only be entered by those who can afford to try to sell by volume, like an industrial factory setting. And so that puts the small scale person out of business. And that's typical. It doesn't matter if it's pigs or it's t-shirts. It works the same way. But maybe not as in trade policies, government subsidies. All the stuff tends to work out similarly. And so then you get the rise of these corporations. And the people who can't contract with these corporations, they can't compete in terms of prices. And there's only so many contracts for a certain number of pigs or chickens or whatever. And that there's a video in this week's submodule about dairy farming in the United States, where like Walmart would used to contract with individual dairy farmers, which could stay at a small scale. But then Walmart, it had a middle management company, but then Walmart decided to go direct to industrial suppliers. And so the small scale dairy farmers in the U.S., they tend to be, kind of a dying breed because Walmart no longer goes in a more direct line to them. It went around them and cut out the middle. And that's a good business decision for Walmart, but it means that small scale dairy, if they have no contract, there's no one to buy their milk. So they can't sell their milk, so they can't be dairy farmers anymore. And not everybody can get these contracts because in order to get a contract from somewhere like Walmart, you have to be able to provide 10,000 gallons. Well, small scale dairy farm can't do that. Maybe they can. I'm not as familiar with dairy, but say, 100,000 gallons, whatever number it needs to be. If you can't do that, they're not going to grant you a contract. And so that makes the small scale dairy no longer feasible. And that's just the reality, the whys of why small scale farming is kind of going out and more industrial streamlined processes are coming in. These are all reasons for why the world is the way it is with farming in this country. And then there's also just this other factor. It's a sociocultural way of life change that besides the governmental changes, the trade changes, the rise of corporations, and all that goes along with that, it's not just a corporation issue. It's not just a government issue. It's a way of life change where most people that are in this class have almost certainly heard the line that, everybody needs to go to college to get a good job. That that people want these jobs, these healthcare jobs, engineering jobs. They want political jobs or to become lawyers and doctors. Like, how many people have heard, they've heard, oh, you could be a lawyer, a doctor, or a farmer, all in the same sentence. Very few, I would wager. That farming is not held up as this sort of prestigious profession like it used to be. That when my dad entered farming, being a farmer was kind of a good thing. There's a certain respect associated with it, a cultural, honor to it. But in today's time, that's not the way it tends to be. It tends to be more, our populace tends to think more about going into different occupations besides farming or agriculture. Not everywhere, but in many places, you rarely will meet a school counselor that's going to say, oh, you could do farming. They'll give you plenty of options, but farming is not necessarily going to be anywhere near the top of the list as a good occupation to pick. But maybe it is. But it's just not sold that way to the mass populace. That's a cultural change. And also, there is a reason that people kind of went away from farming, is that it's not the most stable of professions. Sure, you'll hear about family farms that lived for hundreds of years, but those hundreds of years were unstable with weather conditions can influence. If you're growing crops, you can lose everything in 1 year. Your pigs could get a disease. and all your herd could die, and then you might be out of business if you don't have enough money saved up as a farmer to survive the bad times. And some farmers save, some don't, just like everyday people. Some people live paycheck to paycheck, some don't. And there's just a lack of stability anytime, because a farmer is essentially, like small scale farmer, is in business for themselves. They are the CEO. They are they may have people hired for them, but they're kind of an entrepreneur. There's no security. They're not guaranteed a paycheck. And the weather can make that go sideways. The markets that they sell to, the prices vary. That there's less stability in that kind of occupation, especially today, than there was 40 years ago or 50 years ago. And that the stability got less and less and less. And so farmers would tell, like my dad did. He says, yeah, you don't want to be a farmer. There's too much risk involved. Go do something else. So I went and did mechanics and philosophy and various things. And here I am today, not farming. And that there was an encouragement to kind of move away from farming because it's a harder life. It can be, especially on the small scale. It's got a form of gambling built into it where you're at the mercy of natural conditions. And that's it's kind of like, think about a business like any kind of healthcare profession. There's always going to be a need for healthcare. But, unless we find some, super medications or some way to modify our genomes so we don't get sick at all, maybe in a futuristic environment that would be the case. But in contemporary society, there's always going to be a need for healthcare because people are always going to get sick. And that's unpredictable, and people don't want to be sick. So healthcare exists because of this natural phenomena that always happens, namely people get sick. So the healthcare industry has stability, whereas with farming, it's dependent on natural phenomena like disease and weather conditions, environmental conditions, just like healthcare is. But the reality is no one's going to pay the farmer if the environment goes sideways and wipes out their herd. Whereas if the environment goes sideways and a bunch of people get sick, well, that bunch of people is going to be running to the doctor. So they're both based on biological, natural things that arise for all humans. And yet one of those has stability, whereas the other one doesn't. And it's because of that a disease or sickness, healthcare will get paid. A farmer, disease and sickness cost the farmer money when it comes to its plants and its animals. And no one's around to pay them unless there's some government subsidy, disaster relief. But typically not nearly enough to make a profit. And so there's some of that involved. So people encouraged their children not to enter that way of life. And so there's been a constant reduction. If you looked at a graph, it would be a line going down, 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 as far as new young people entering agriculture. You can look it up on the internet and look at the numbers. And there's plenty of things. You can look up decline in young farmers. And you'll see various reports about how young people are not going into farming nearly as much. Each year it's becoming less and less and less because it's extremely hard to get into the business. Remember those corporate contracts you have to have, and you have to have the land. You have to have the money to buy into it. It's the epitome of it takes money to make money in farming. You have to have the money to put the fence up, to buy the feed, and then you have to wait for the animals to reach certain weights, and they could get sick, and there's quite a bit of risk involved in it. And I'm not saying that to discourage anybody from farming, not at all. I think my family does it on a larger scale, and I would do it on a smaller scale. I've kind of thought about eventually I would go and get back into a few pigs because I really like the animals. But in terms of using that as my only source of income in today's time, that may not be viable. But we're seeing some turnaround. There is turnaround in the numbers. It may be that farming once again comes back to the forefront and it's up there on the pedestal with doctors and lawyers and various other ways of making a living. Maybe. But not if people don't put it back up there. And there was this sort of, well, if we go to college to get a good job, typically that's going to be a city job. It's going to be urban. That's this notion of urban flight, that people flew from farms to cities. And that is why industrial practices exist today, because we still have just as much demand for food just like we did 100 years ago. It's even greater now because there's even more people. And so the demand is there for more food. But there's all of these factors that are in play that discourage a smaller scale operation. Now, some people know their small scale operations still exist and they tend to be able to survive. But typically they do that through farmers markets that people may be familiar with. They do it through subsidies, and they tend to have to be a pretty clever person to navigate it if they're doing it at the small 30 pig scale. Now if they're up there at the 100, 500 pig scale, they likely have a corporate contract. That's no longer small scale at that point. The overall results, though, of this is that about 95, 97%, some people say 99% of U.S. meat is produced via some form of factory means, this more industrialized processes. And another side effect is most people are far, far separated from their meat and where it comes from. We may see pigs in petting zoos, everyday people, but many contemporary children, they don't grow up having to feed the pigs or the chickens or the cows. They don't go through the process of finding the chicken in the yard and and killing it, plucking it, going through the process of processing the chicken. Not nearly as many U.S. children today do that as would have been the case 40 years ago. And so people tend to have a more sanitary experience with their meat. They go in the store, it's in a little nice plastic covered package. They take it home, they cook it. They don't see that it was a living, breathing, warm animal that they petted, and they understand that it can feel and it can have some semblance of thought of its own, that it can be interesting. People are familiar with cats and dogs, our typical house pet animal. But people used to be just as familiar with pigs and cows and chickens and turkeys. Not so much today. That means there's a disconnect between the consumer that's eating the meat versus the actual animal that the meat is coming from. That can create a sort of desensitization, an unawareness of what it was like for that animal growing up. And so then we get to this question. The simple answer to it is, are factory practices especially mean to our food? The